Yes, it's that time again. Another worst to best. This is where I look at an artist or band and rate all of their studio albums from their worst to their best. So, the usual preamble, fun times. Obviously, this is my personal opinion. I am not saying that the first album that I talk about is the absolute definitive worst album. I'm not saying that the last album I'm going to be talking about is the absolute definitive best album. I'm just saying that if all of these albums were laid out in front of me, which one would I grab first and which ones would I grab last? Also, I'm only looking at the studio releases of their LPs. So no live stuff, no compilations, no EPs, and I'm only looking at like the regular studio releases, so no like special editions or extra bonus content, just whatever they released in terms of the studio. And one last thing, this is actually a Patreon request. This is from Chris H. If you want to be cool like Chris, go on down below. I've left the link there for my Patreon. That's enough of a preamble from me. Let's dive into Styx. And I'm rating all of their 16 studio albums. So let's dive into album 16. Number 16. Day after day, night after night. Edge of the Century, released in 1990. So this one, like finding the worst album of a Styx catalog was really, really tricky, and it was harder to find which ones were worse rather than which one was better, because there's still lots of great stuff on this particular album. It just happened to be the one that I didn't connect with the most, and what really brought this album down for me was how much cringe there was. I mean, the year of 1990 was such a strange one. Like, hip hop and glam metal and the big hair metal was still very, very prominent, but it was starting to taper off. Like the gangster hip hop and the gangster rap and the big Goliath that would become grunge and that rock was just peaking on the horizon. It wasn't quite there, but it was just edging its head. So music of that time, especially from bands from the 70s, didn't know what to do. And I could tell Styx within Edge of the Century was trying their best at doing something new while still staying true to their roots. And oh boy, there's so many moments where it doesn't quite work. Like, there are a few albums, like All in a Day's Work, that really brings back that 70s soft rock ballads. And I know that was something that Styx was really, really good for. But then we get tracks such as Love is the Ritual, Show Me the Way, and Not Dead Yet. And The World Tonight, I'm just like, oh no, because it's just so cringeworthy. I think at the end of the day, the only track that I really, really enjoy off of this one is All in a Day's Work, and whew, that's a little bit of a slog to get through. So yeah. Anyway, that's my thoughts about that. Let's move on to the next one. Number 15. Let's go. Brave New World, released in 1999. Okay, so this one I had to put above Edge of the Century, but not by much. And that's not necessarily a knock against Brave New World. That's just to elevate Edge of the Century. Only because this one doesn't have that cringe to it. So there's got a little bit more of a bite to it. There's a little bit more of an oomph. Like I Will Be Your Witness has kind of this boy band feel to it and less of a rock feeling that I actually kind of enjoy. That harmonizing, that catchiness, it leaves you wanting more. But I also love that Number One and Everything Is Cool has some more bite and drive to it. Like, I feel like they're taking the better parts of what made the 90s rock special and incorporated it into the Styx feel. But this album is still a mess. Best New Face is about 10 years too old to be released in a 1999 album. Like, this would have served itself much better on Edge of the Century. And there doesn't seem to be any real focus for what this album was supposed to be. Like, they're trying all these different things from the 90s that aren't quite working. Like, Heavy Water is almost a Green Day track with its rhythm section, but it still maintains that 70s rocker section. And High Crimes is just... what? Like it's almost like this reggae feel that's trying to be a hip hop song, and I just don't quite get it. And Just Fell In is like a doo-wop rock track from like the 50s. So like they're trying all these different styles, and instead of it feeling like this celebration of all these different motifs and styles from yesteryear, it just kind of feels like a giant mess. All I have to really say is that even though it's still a little bit of a cringe track, my favorite track on this is still Brave New Face. It does channel that early 90s power line feel. That's about it. Let's move on to the next one. Number 14. Styx, self-titled release, released in 1972. All right, we're going right from their later albums all the way back to their first album. And this album, kind of similar to Brave New World, is a little bit all over the place, and I feel like you're going to get that with any debut album. Like, it's very rare that a band will just hit the ground running with their best work, and their self-titled one is just kind of that. Now, it is, on the one hand, one of their more proggy pieces, so on paper, it should almost be that this is one of my favorite albums, but really, I just don't feel all that invested in it. The Movement for a Common Man proggy piece, like the big epic on this, I'm not sure what really was the point. Like, all the spoken word parts on it is a little distracting at times. It doesn't feel all that well flushed out. It's good, but like, I feel like they're very green, they're very fresh, they're not quite as comfortable in their own setting yet, and I feel like they've got lots of great work ahead of them. So it's not necessarily that any of the tracks on here are bad, it's just there's no real substance on here outside of maybe the Movement for a Common Man. It was a good starting off point, and I know they have a lot of good things ahead of them. So that's all I really have to say about their self-titled work. It's fine. But yeah, let's move on to more of a controversial opinion with this next one. Number 13. Paradise Theater, released in 1981. All right. I know putting this one at number 13, people are going to be like, why would you put this one here when there is so clearly another album that needs to be here? Especially in terms of a big concept album. Okay, for me, it just kind of comes down to this album is boring. I know. So let's get some of the good stuff out. I love the atmosphere. I love the like 1920s to 1940s feel about it. I love how this album opens up and closes. I love the drive. I love the passion that's behind this album. It just feels like it falls flat on its face though. Like, it doesn't have any stay for me. And I've listened to this album countless times, and each time I'm like, what is the point? There's not a whole lot of actual tracks on here that I can really pinpoint and be like, that's a good track, or that's a good moment. Like, once we get over the overture and like the first track, like the only ones that I can really point to are She Cares and Snow Blinding. And those are really the only tracks that I really enjoyed. I wish I had more positive things to say about Paradise Theater, because I know it's a fan favorite. It just doesn't do a whole lot for me. So yeah, let's move on to another album that I don't think I'll have too much controversy over. Number 12. Big Bang Theory, released in 2005. So a lot of people would be wondering, why would I be including this when it's really just a covers album? And like, it's a studio release, so I gotta incorporate it on here. I really love some of the things that they do about it. And with covers, you always run the risk of either making it a clone of the original piece, or it's basically just you playing the song in your own style. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. They do make it their own, but I always feel like they play it very safe. At no point do I ever feel like they're reinventing the track, as opposed to like just putting it in their own particular style. And it feels like, honestly, it just feels like they're having fun. And that fun aspect is bled through, and I feel like I'm having fun. So that's what kind of elevates it, but that's also why it doesn't go any higher on this list in terms of being on the better side of it. I find myself enjoying myself. I find myself really digging it, but I never really feel like, oh man, they really captured the essence of what those tracks really were. I will also say that it was a very bold choice to start off the album with I Am the Walrus from the Beatles. Now, it's not necessarily the worst interpretation of this track. That one still goes to Bono for the Across the Universe soundtrack, but it's also far from the best, which goes for Jim Carrey off of George Martin's album In My Life. So yeah, it's kind of like hugging the middle of the road there. So yeah, anyway, that's all I gotta say for Big Bang Theory. Let's move on to the next. Number 11. Kilroy Was Here, released in 1983. All right. Let the hate come. Yeah, so on the one hand, I'm sure most people aren't surprised that it's on this side of the worst to best line, but other people would be like, whoa, why is it so high up here touching the best side? Okay, so I don't really need to talk about the weaknesses of this album. It's been demonized far too much outside of all like the background scene of what was going on with the band, and I'm going to leave that at the door. I feel like that's a conversation that is outside of the scope of a worst to best. Now it does bleed through a little bit, and it's one of the biggest weaknesses of the album because you can tell that there's a lot of conflict going on in the band, and it doesn't serve like a Fleetwood Mac or a Yes to elevate the music and bring about the best of all peoples. It's bringing out the worst of all peoples. Like, this is much more of like a final cut in terms of a band members struggling for control of what's being put on the album. I'm going to talk about the music. I'm just going to leave this to the music. I love the concept of this album. It was like way off in the future. It's this uprising, it's this rebellion, it's this raw aspect, and so it's really fun in that. And I also love a lot of the hits off of this album. I love Don't Let It End and Throughout This Night. They're very much my favorite tracks off of this, and even the big single of Mr. Roboto I find is very fun. Like, it's very infectious. There's a reason why this is one of Styx's biggest tracks. The Heavy Metal Poisoning is one of the few tracks that actually do have lead guitars on it, because this is a very synth heavy album, and that's not necessarily a knock against it. And even like the singing style, that's very much like Zappa or the Bungles, or like this kind of new age feel to it. It just doesn't really feel all that oomph. It does kind of end on a little bit of a cringy piece. Even though Don't Let It End is my favorite track off of this album, I still recognize that it's kind of on the cringe scale a little bit. But yeah, I honestly, in my opinion, I don't hate this album as much as a lot of people do. I like that they took a chance and they tried something completely different. Even though it didn't necessarily all work out all that much, there's still something very special about Kilroy Was Here, outside of the fact of all the negative stuff that was kind of behind the scenes. Anyway, let's move on to the next one. Number 10. Man of Miracles, released in 1974. Man of Miracles, in one respects, is very much seeing what worked in the past and trying to figure out what to do with that now. So there's some really good moments on this. Like, I love the build up for the Golden Lark into Song for Susanna. That's definitely a real high point. I love that. It was dripping with gold. I really also love the proggy aspect of this piece. I really love where it goes. I also really like that big, deep purple John Lord keyboard solo on Southern Woman, and the opening sequence to the title track of Man of Miracles. I enjoy Christopher, Mr. Christopher. It's quite of a bop. I feel like, there's a lot to really dig your teeth into. It's very memorable. Now, one of the weaknesses is actually one of the strengths in that this is much more of a straightforward rock album more than anything else. You've got Rock and Roll Feeling, Having a Ball, Lies, and as I already mentioned, Southern Woman, just being straight up rock tracks. And I feel like when they really hunker themselves down and put themselves in that rock box, it's great. But they're also a bit more uninteresting because they don't really deviate or add anything new to the current scene or the current climate. At least with Southern Woman, it has that really nice, deep purple aspect of that John Lord keyboard solo in it. But all those other songs don't really do a whole lot. And I find myself not really coming back to this album as much as I come back to other ones. So yeah, that's all I really have to say about Man of Miracles. It's more of like a forgettable one. Like, I don't really think about it all that much outside of A Song for Susanna, but yeah. So yeah, that's about it for Man of Miracles. Let's move on to the next one. Number 9. Styx 2, released in 1973. So the album that came out before Man of Miracles, Styx 2. This one, I love the longer tracks off of it. Like the 3rd track of A Day and the 6th track of Father of OSA. Really, really love these tracks. They're much more proggy. There's a lot of meat to them. But my favorite one is Lady. And this is kind of the big single from the album. And I think this might be their first big breakthrough hit. And I really, really dig it. Like, it's something that I can still think about even after all the sounds that, you know, Styx brought to the table. And unlike other albums, it's really hard pressed to find like a big weakness for it. Like Styx 2 is a very solid rock album. They still have these proggy pieces throughout it because, I mean, 1973, that was the golden year for prog. So of course they're going to be putting in some prog aspects. I think the only reason why this didn't get higher on my list is that those tracks weren't as catchy. They weren't quite as memorable outside of Lady. So even though those proggy pieces were much more of a bop, I didn't feel all myself like invested in what I was hearing, and I didn't really want to come back to it quite as much. Oddly enough, it's also the only other album that I have in my collection outside of The Grand Illusion. So yeah, that's all I gotta say for Styx 2. Let's move on to the next one. Number 8. Cornerstone, released in 1979. So in some respects, this album was probably the first real disappointment for me for the Styx discography. Coming off the tails of Pieces of 8, I was like ready for something big and something massive, and Cornerstone was always listed on Spotify as being like one of the better albums, so I'm like, okay, what do we got for Cornerstone? It's a big ballad album, and I know that this is probably why it got so much popular appeal, because the big power ballads of the late 70s was what really rose Styx to stardom within the 80s. And if you're in the mood for the power ballads, this album is going to scratch your itch perfectly. But if you're not going to get into this album at all. Now, it still has a number of really, really good bangers. Like, I particularly love Lights and Why Me, even though Why Me is a little bit of like, ooh boy, I don't know about that, but it also has quite a bit of duds. Like, even though people love Babe, I think it's just a little too melodramatic. I think it's a little too on the nose. I think it's just too unoriginal, and I just but I mean, those moments that it shines very well, which is kind of what puts it where it is on this this list. So yeah, that's kind of where I have it for this one. Let's move on to the next one. Number 7. The Mission, released in 2017. Okay, this is another one that I really, really struggled with because I knew how great this album was from everybody around me. I never actually had a chance in 2017 to sit down and listen to it. So as I was doing this, this was the first time that I really had a chance to sit down and give it a spin. And I can understand why people really, really like this, especially with all the albums that had come out before in the 90s and in the 80s. This one for me is just, it's the best way that I could put this was it was very similar to Clockwork Angels by Rush in that I wanted to like this album a lot more than I ended up liking it. Now, this album is far from being a bad album. In fact, it's kind of the mid album in this worst to best, but it's also not their best work. I still love the drive. I love the return to form. I love the big 70s rock aesthetic that's found on this, but like there's no real big track or big moment that I'm like, there we go, there's a good moment. So for me, this one's kind of just a middle of the road album for Styx. For me, this album is a very good album, but it's also nothing all that special. And so that's kind of where I'm sitting at with The Mission. I love the concept, I love the storyline, but unlike say Paradise Theater or Kilroy was here, I don't feel the atmosphere. I don't feel the setting that this album takes place in. Anyway, that's kind of where I'm at for The Mission. I don't really have a whole lot to say about this album. It's still fine, it's still good, but it wouldn't be one that I would run to go and check out. So That's what I've got to say about the mission. It's fine. It's good. I understand why people love it, and I get the appeal. It's just not necessarily for me. So yeah, let's move on to the next one. Number 6. The Serpentis Rising, released in 1973. So we're starting to really feel the Styx sound on the Serpentis Rising. They're starting to feel more like themselves and what makes them stand out from the crowd, as opposed to just kind of generic 70s rock that I feel like the first handful of albums do. Like, there's some really, really great bangers off of this album. The track Jonas Pilzer, and I think that's it. It has this Who feeling at the beginning of it, like almost from Who's Next. And I also love that yes movement from the main part of that track as well, like something from A Time and a Word. And I love the darker groove that we have from the title track of the Serpentis Rising. And so like these two tracks of Jonas Pilzer and the Serpentis Rising just elevate this album so much. Now, obviously, it still has a lot of that 70s generic rock to it, but it doesn't really feel like a negative. It just feels, I don't want to say padding, because padding isn't quite the right word, but it does kind of have this oomph. Now, I will say that there are some moments where I'm like, whoa, what's going on? Like, what the hell is this? As bad as this with the plexiglass toilet. I wonder why this is the longest track off of this album, because it is very clearly the worst track off of it. Krakatoa is just weird, and not necessarily in a good way. Like, I know a lot of bands were doing this kind of like noisy stuff, but yeah, I just wonder what was the point. And the Hallelujah chorus is good, but it's still weird and not in a good point. So overall, like, this album is definitely on the better end of the spectrum. We're coming into the top 5. So what are we going for the number 5 album? Let's find out. Number 5.
Here we go again. Hands making circles that you can't turn back again. Sky turning blue.
Silorama, released in 2003. Okay, so out of all the albums released from Styx, this was the one that surprised me the most. Released in 2003, yes, I put it way above the mission. I'm sorry, but I love how much of a bop this album is. There's so many moments off of this album where I'm like, wow. Like, they're capturing the retro prog of like a Spock's beard perfectly. Like, this is what Spock's beard would sound like in about 10 to 15 years. So they were laying down the foundation for what those styles of bands would sound like. And it has, like I said, some really, really bops on this. Brave New World is one that really, really stood out for me. I also love Kiss Your Ass Goodbye and Killing the Thing That You Love. It's got this raw energy and raw power about it. There are still a few points off this album that feels like 90s rock and not in a flattering way. Like, this album is about 3 years too late for a lot of those tracks. It definitely has that, hey, fellow kids, what's happening kind of a feel to it. But luckily it doesn't last. Like, it's the outlier rather than the overall album as overall. So yeah, I think this album doesn't get enough praise. Like, it is one of my favorite albums from them, obviously at being number 5. But yeah, I still love it. I still really, really love it. Yeah, that's what I have to say about Silorama. I think you guys should really check it out if you haven't already. So let's move on to the next one. Number 4. Equinox, released in 1975. So this album, I think out of all the albums that Styx has done, is probably the most straightforward rock album out of the bunch. It's front to back solid, and honestly, I'd be really hard pressed to find a downside to this album. I'm feeling flavors of ELP and Led Zeppelin on tracks like Prelude 12, and some big fun vibes from tracks such as like Born for Adventure and Light Up. These tracks are real big bops. And I think the only big downside is because all the tracks are so much of a bop, there's no one track that really stands out from the rest. Like, if I had to choose my favorite tracks, it'd be like Lonely Child, Light Up, and Born for Adventure. And now we're really getting like the Styx feeling. Like I could see this being like the first real classic Styx album. But there are 3 other albums off of this that I like a little bit more than Equinox. This would definitely be one of the first ones that I put on in terms of like start to finish listen, because now that we're getting this like pure rock album, I'm really digging it. But we've got 3 more ones to talk about, so let's talk about number 3. Number 3. Pieces of 8, released in 1978. Okay, this is another one that I feel like people can unifiably say this is one of their favorites, and I 100% agree, and I can understand why. The one thing that drew me out of this album more is that, like, there's not a whole lot of extra variety found within this that the other 2 albums that I'm going to be talking about have. I feel like it's definitely a step up from Equinox in that there's a lot more bops on it. Like, you gotta love the big tracks of The Message. Lords of the Ring is such a brilliant and hard, fast, and punchy track. And of course, the big track of Renegade. Really love it. But it is also a little bit more in your face than other albums from the band. It has a lot more of a drive than any of the other albums, and it's hard to not feel energized and ready to do something after listening to this album. The only real justification for having it at number 3 is that I like the other 2 albums a little bit more. So let's talk about them. Once I reveal which one is number 2, it automatically lets you know which one is number 1. So let's talk about number 2 first. Number 2. Seems you finally had to choose. Crystal Ball, released in 1976. I don't know why I love this album so much, but I really do. I love how experimental this album is in relation to the other albums that were released between like 1975 and 1978, or even 1979. And I love how pretty much all of those experiments work in one way or another. Even though this album doesn't have as much of a hook and as much of a powerhouse as, say, Pieces of 8, Cornerstone, or Equinox, I love how somber and smaller the moments are found within this album. I really love the flow and the flavors. I love how this wasn't just a straight up rock album, and it's not just a we're the biggest sound on here. It does its best to just kind of take a step back and really enjoy the smaller moments. Like, I love Mademoiselle and I love Crystal Ball, but honestly, my favorite track is the 1-2 punch of Claire de Lune and Ballerina. Ballerina's sweet symphony at the end of this album is such a stark and bold stance. Like, it's somber without being melodramatic. And so, yeah, I just get this really warm feeling when I'm listening to this album. I get this like really nice hug when I sit down and listen to it. It's definitely, as I mentioned, not a big rocking album like the other albums that precede it or even come after it, but it is definitely one that I love so very much. So, yeah, that's why I put Crystal Ball at number 2. So, we already know what number 1 is. Let's just dive in and talk about it. Number 1. The Grand Illusion, released in 1977. Yup. I mean, I know I'm coming at this album very biased because it was the only album besides Styx 2 that I had sit down and listened to from start to finish before starting this whole endeavor, but it still holds up. Like, there were a few times where albums would come in and start to challenge my love for the Grand Illusion. Like, Crystal Ball got really close, and same with Pieces of 8. Like, those 2 albums just blew me away, but each of the tracks off of this are just banger after banger after banger. I can't really pinpoint any kind of weakness. The album has a really great diversity of tracks. It's not just straight up rock. It's not just straight up ballad. It's got a lot of different flavors throughout it. They're all good. Like, I can't really pick out any tracks that are my favorite. If I had to, obviously Come Sail Away, but I also love Castle Walls and the title track of Grand Illusion. These tracks just bring me back to that really fun, light rock from the 70s that I hold very dear in my heart. And yeah, it's no wonder that the Grand Illusion is my favorite out of all the albums from Styx. It really holds up. It's one of those things where even though Come Sail Away is probably their biggest and best tracks that everybody knows about. This is one of those rare opportunities where like a track that everybody knows is on an album that is front to back so stellar that like I can't believe all these other tracks aren't getting the light of day as much as Come Sail Away does. But, you know, there you go. That's just how it works. Grand Illusion is my favorite album from Styx, and how can it not be? So yeah, that's my list. That's my whole kit and caboodle of Styx from worst to best. What did you guys think? What is your favorite album from Styx? What is your least favorite album? What albums do you agree with me on here? What albums do I know you're inevitably going to say that you disagree with? But yeah, let me know of your own thoughts about Styx. What's your favorite album? What's your least favorite album? Let me know by commenting down below. And again, a huge thank you to Chris H for donating to my Patreon. If you want to be cool like Chris, I've left the link down below for you to donate to my Patreon. He has been extremely patient within this because he donated almost a year and a half ago. And I really thank you for giving me the time that I needed to get this one right. And I think I did. So yeah, thank you all as well so much for watching. You guys are definitely the best. And until next time, notes out.